You don't wake up and become the same person you were yesterday unless you repeat the same thoughts, the same emotions, and the same habits that keep you locked in the same life. Most people think their life changes when their circumstances change. But the truth is, your life changes the moment you change your mind. Right now, your brain is running on patterns, automatic thoughts, familiar feelings, old reactions. And every time you repeat those patterns, you strengthen them. You literally wire your brain to stay the same. But here's what most people don't realize. You are not stuck with the brain you have. You are capable of building a new one. The moment you decide to interrupt your old way of thinking, something powerful begins to happen. At first, it feels uncomfortable. Because your mind wants to return to what it knows: stress, worry, doubt, comparison. The same emotional loop you've been living in for years. But if you stay aware in that moment, if you don't react automatically, you begin to create space. And in that space, you begin to choose. You can choose a different thought. You can choose a different emotion. You can choose a different identity. And when you do that consistently, your brain starts to reorganize itself. New neural pathways form. Old emotional addictions weaken. And slowly you stop becoming the version of you that survives and start becoming the version of you that creates. Every morning is your reset point. Not because the world changes when you wake up, but because you have the opportunity to change how you meet the world. Before you reach for your phone, before you react to anything outside of you, there is a moment that belongs only to you. And in that moment, you can decide, am I going to live from memory today, or am I going to live from possibility? Most people live from memory. They wake up, think the same thoughts, feel the same emotions, expect the same outcomes, and then wonder why nothing changes. But if you begin your day by consciously choosing your state, calm instead of anxious, gratitude instead of lack, clarity instead of chaos, you are no longer a victim of your day. You become the creator of it. Your body doesn't know the difference between a real experience and an imagined. So when you mentally rehearse your future with emotion, your brain begins to believe it is already happening. And when your brain believes it, your body starts to follow. This is how you rewire yourself, not through force, not through struggle, but through repetition with awareness. You don't need to fight your old self. You just stop feeding it. Every time you catch yourself drifting into old thoughts, you return. Every time you feel pulled into old emotions, you pause. And in that pause, you choose again. That is how change happens. Not in one dramatic moment, but in hundreds of small decisions to think differently, feel differently, and be different. And over time, something remarkable occurs. The new you stops feeling like effort. It becomes natural because you have trained your mind to operate from a new baseline. Happiness is not something you chase. It is something you attract. It is a state you cultivate by how you think, how you feel, and how you show up before anything your external world changes. So start your day right, not by reacting to the world, but by creating your internal world first. Because once your mind is rewired, your life has no choice but to follow. Your thoughts and emotions are not just passing experiences that disappear without consequence. They are active forces that continuously shape the structure and function of your brain. Every thought you think creates a neural firing pattern, and every repeated thought strengthens that pattern, making it more automatic over time. This means that what you repeatedly focus on mentally is not just influencing your mood in the moment. It is literally shaping the architecture of your mind. When a thought is repeated often enough, the brain begins to treat it as familiar. Familiarity creates efficiency, and efficiency creates habit. This is how the brain conserves energy. Instead of processing every situation from scratch, it relies on previously strengthened pathways. So if a person repeatedly thinks in patterns of worry, fear, self-doubt, or anger, those patterns become the brain's default response system. The mind doesn't question them anymore. It simply runs them automatically. This is why people often feel like they are stuck in the same emotional cycles. It is not because life is constantly repeating itself in identical ways, but because the internal response to life has become repetitive. Two people can experience the same external situation and interpret it completely differently based on their internal wiring. One person may see opportunity while another sees threat. The difference is not the situation itself, but the trained patterns of thought then interpret it. Emotions are deeply connected to these thought patterns. A thought does not remain abstract. It immediately produces a chemical response in the body. For example, a fearful thought triggers stress hormones, while a grateful thought produces calming and uplifting neurochemicals. When the same emotional state is repeatedly activated, the body begins to expect it. Over time, the body becomes conditioned to live in those emotional states, almost as if it develops an addiction to them. This is how people can become addicted to stress or sadness without realizing it. The mind thinks the thought, the body feels the emotion, and together they create a feedback loop. The body then remembers the feeling and begins to crave the familiar chemical environment. Even when there is no external reason for stress or sadness, the body can generate it simply because it has been conditioned to do so repeatedly. This cycle is powerful because it operates below conscious awareness. Most people do not actively choose their thoughts throughout the day. Instead, thoughts arise automatically based on memory, environment, and habit. These automatic thoughts then produce automatic emotional reactions, which reinforce the same identity over and over again. In this way, a person's past continues to recreate their present. If nothing interrupts this cycle, it continues indefinitely. The brain becomes a record of the past, constantly replaying old experiences in new situations. This is why change often feels difficult. It is not because change is impossible, but because the brain resists unfamiliar patterns. It prefers predictability, even if that predictability is uncomfortable. However, awareness is the turning point. The moment a person becomes conscious of their thought patterns, they create space between stimulus and response. In that space lies the ability to choose differently. Instead of automatically reacting with the same emotion, there's an opportunity to observe the thought and redirect it. This small moment of awareness is the beginning of breaking the cycle. When new thoughts are consistently chosen, new emotional responses begin to form. At first, this feels unnatural because the brain is resisting the change. It is wired to return to what is familiar. But with repetition and attention, new neural pathways begin to strengthen. Gradually, what once felt forced becomes more natural. The brain adapts to the new direction. Over time, this process leads to measurable changes in how a person thinks, feels, and behaves. The internal landscape shifts, and with it, perception of the external world also changes. Circumstances may remain the same for a while, but the interpretation of those circumstances transforms. This is the beginning of genuine change, not by altering the external world first, but by reshaping the internal one. Ultimately, the realization that thoughts and emotions are shaping the brain places responsibility back into the individual's hands. It means that identity is not fixed. It is continuously being written through repeated mental and emotional activity. And because it is being written, it can also be rewritten through conscious effort, awareness, and consistent practice. No, you are not fixed in the identity you currently hold, no matter how long you have believed certain things about yourself, or how deeply those patterns feel embedded. The brain and body are not static systems. They are dynamic, adaptive, and constantly changing in response to experience, repetition, and attention. This means that who you are today is not a final version. It is simply the result of everything you have repeatedly thought, felt, and done up to this point. Neuroscience shows that the brain has a property called neuroplasticity, which means it can reorganize itself by forming new connections throughout life. This is not limited to childhood or early development. It continues as long as you are alive. Every time you learn something new, think differently, or respond in a new way. The brain adjusts its wiring. Old connections can weaken when they are no longer used, while new ones strengthen when they are consistently activated. This is important because it directly challenges the belief that personality is permanent. Many people identify strongly with statements like, "I am anxious." "Sa, I'm not confident," or "I have always been this way." But these are not fixed truths, they are descriptions of repeated patterns. When a person repeats a thought long enough, it becomes part of their identity. The brain then reinforces it by making those thoughts more automatic, which makes the identity feel solid and unchangeable. However, what feels like identity is often just familiarity. The brain prefers familiar states because they require less energy. This is why even uncomfortable emotional states can feel normal over time. If a person has spent years in stress, their nervous system adapts to that environment. Stress becomes the baseline, not because it is natural, but because it is familiar. The same applies to sadness, anger, or self-doubt. These are not permanent traits. They are learned responses that have been reinforced through repetition. The body also plays a major role in maintaining this sense of fixed identity. Emotions are not only mental experiences, they are chemical states in the body. When a person repeatedly feels a certain emotion, their body begins to memorize it. Over time, the body can anticipate and even generate those emotional states without external triggers. This creates the feeling of being stuck in a certain version of oneself, even when circumstances change. But because these patterns are learned, they can also be unlearned. The same mechanism that created them can be used to change them. When a person begins to think in new ways consistently, the brain starts to form new neural connections. At first, these new thoughts feel unnatural because they do not match the existing wiring. The brain resists them because it is efficient, not because it is correct. It prefers what it already knows. This resistance often makes people believe that change is not possible for them. But resistance is not a sign of limitation. It is a sign of transition. It means the brain is being asked to operate differently. If new thoughts are repeated with enough attention and emotional engagement, they begin to override old patterns. The brain gradually shifts its baseline. The body also begins to respond to these new patterns. When new thoughts produce new emotions, the chemical environment of the body changes. Over time, the body becomes conditioned to these new emotional states. This is how transformation becomes physical, not just mental. The nervous system begins to adapt to a new way of being. What makes this process powerful is that it does not require external change first. A person does not need to wait for life to improve before they begin to think differently. Instead, change begins internally. When internal states shift, perception shifts. And when perception shifts, behavior naturally follows. Over time, these new behaviors create new experiences, which further reinforce the new identity. The key realization is that identity is not something you discover, it is something you construct through repetition. Every day, through small decisions, thoughts, and emotional responses, you are reinforcing either the past version of yourself or creating a new one. There is no neutral state. Even inaction reinforces existing patterns. This means that transformation is always available, but it requires consistent awareness. The moment you begin to notice automatic thoughts and interrupt them, you create space for something new. That space is where change begins. It is not dramatic at first. It is subtle, often invisible. But over time, those small interruptions accumulate into significant shifts. Eventually, what once required effort becomes natural. The brain adopts new patterns as the default. The body becomes aligned with new emotional states. And the identity that once felt fixed begins to dissolve into something more flexible and evolving. In this way, you are not defined by your past wiring. You are defined by what you repeatedly choose now. Real change does not begin with trying to force new habits or suppress old behaviors. It begins with awareness, because without awareness, everything remains automatic. Most people live inside patterns of thinking, feeling, and reacting without ever noticing that they are happening. The mind runs familiar loops, and the body follows them, creating the same emotional and behavioral outcomes repeatedly. In that state, a person is not truly choosing their life. They are replaying it. Awareness interrupts this automatic cycle. It is the moment when you observe what is happening inside your mind instead of being completely absorbed by it. You begin to notice the thought before it turns into an emotion. You see the emotion before it turns into an action. This simple act of noticing creates distance between you and the pattern. That distance is where transformation becomes possible. Without awareness, a thought feels like reality. If the mind says that something will go wrong, it is immediately accepted as truth and the body responds with stress. If the mind says, I am not enough, the body reacts with contraction, hesitation, and emotional heaviness. These responses happen so quickly that most people never question them. They believe they are simply reacting to life, when they're reacting to internal programs. When awareness enters the picture, the pattern begins to lose its control. Instead of automatically believing every thought, you start to see thoughts as events in the mind rather than facts. You begin to recognize that just because a thought appears does not mean it is true, important, or worth acting on. This realization is subtle but powerful. It breaks the unconscious agreement between thought and identity. As awareness strengthens, you start to notice emotional patterns as well. You can feel when your body is entering a familiar state of stress, anger, or doubt. Instead of immediately reacting, you become capable of observing it. This observation does not suppress the emotion, it simply brings consciousness to it. And when something unconscious becomes conscious, it begins to change. The brain operates largely on prediction. It anticipates what will happen next based on past experience and then prepares the body accordingly. This is why people often feel emotional reactions before they even fully understand the situation. The system is designed for efficiency, not reflection. Awareness disrupts this predictive loop by introducing a pause. In that pause, the automatic response is no longer inevitable. At first, this pause may feel small or insignificant, but it is the foundation of all change. In that moment, instead of reacting in the usual way, there is an opportunity to choose different. That choice might be subtle at first, a different thought, a slower response, a calmer breath, but it signals to the brain that a new pattern is being introduced. Repeated awareness strengthens this ability. Each time you notice an old pattern without automatically following it, you weaken the neural pathway that supports it. At the same time, you create space for new pathways to form. The brain begins to reorganize itself around this new behavior of observation and choice. This process is not about eliminating thoughts or emotions. It is about changing your relationship to them. Instead of being controlled by internal states, you become the observer of them. You are no longer inside every thought or emotion. You are the awareness behind them. This shift changes everything because it moves you from reaction to intention. Without awareness, people often believe they are trying to change, but find themselves repeating the same cycle. They set intentions, but their unconscious patterns override those intentions because they are stronger and more automatic. Awareness is what brings those unconscious patterns into the light so they can no longer operate unseen. As this practice deepens, you begin to recognize triggers more quickly. Situations that once caused immediate emotional reactions now become signals for observation. You notice the familiar feeling arising, and instead of being pulled into it, you pause. That pause becomes the space where choice lives. Over time, awareness begins to reshape identity. Stop seeing yourself as someone who reacts in certain ways and start seeing yourself as someone who notices and chooses. This shift in identity is crucial because behavior always follows identity. When you identify as someone who is conscious rather than automatic, your actions begin to reflect that belief. Eventually, awareness becomes more natural and continuous. You no longer need to force it because it becomes part of how you operate. The mind still produces thoughts and the body still produces emotions, but you are no longer unconsciously controlled by them. You see them, understand them, and decide how to respond. This is the foundation of real change, not struggle against yourself, but conscious observation that allows new choices to emerge. Every morning represents a natural reset point for your mind and body, not because anything external has changed overnight, but because consciousness itself has shifted from one day to the next. When you wake up, your brain is no longer fully locked in the patterns of the previous day, yet it is also not automatically aligned with anything new. In that brief transition, there is a window of opportunity where your mental state is highly impressionable, and what you choose to do in those first moments has a disproportionate influence on the rest of your day. Most people unknowingly close that window immediately. The moment they wake up, they reach for their phone, allowing external information, notifications, and obligations to shape their mental and emotional state before they have even consciously decided how they want to feel. This means their attention is hijacked by the outside world before they have anchored themselves internally. As a result, their day begins in reaction rather than intention, and the rest of the day often follows that same reactive pattern. When you begin your morning without awareness, you are essentially allowing your brain to default to its most familiar state. If that familiar state is stress, worry, or mental clutter, then those emotions become the foundation for everything that follows. The nervous system wakes up and immediately reactivates old thought patterns, which then generate familiar emotional responses. This is not a conscious choice. It is automatic conditioning. The brain simply continues what it has been trained to do repeatedly. However, the morning also offers something unique. In the early phase of waking, the brain is more flexible and less rigidly locked into established patterns. This makes it easier to influence than later in the day, when external stimuli accumulate and reinforce habitual reaction. In this state, even small intentional actions can have a significant impact on your emotional baseline. Choosing to begin the day consciously means interrupting the automatic sequence before it fully activates. Instead of immediately engaging with external input, you create space to direct attention inward. In that space, you can observe your thoughts rather than being driven by them. You can notice your emotional state without immediately reacting to it. This simple shift changes the trajectory of the entire day because it reestablishes internal control before external influence takes over. When you intentionally decide how you want to feel at the start of your day, you are not engaging in wishful thinking. You are setting a neurological and physiological direction. The brain responds to repeated focus and the body responds to emotional consistency. If you begin your morning by cultivating calm, gratitude, clarity, or focus, you are signaling to your nervous system that this is the baseline state to maintain. Over time, this practice begins to recondition the body. The nervous system learns that it does not need to default to stress or urgency upon waking. Instead, it begins to recognize that a different emotional state is possible and even expected. This gradual shift changes the internal chemistry of the body, making new emotional states more accessible throughout the day. The power of the morning also lies in its symbolic function. It represents a new beginning, regardless of what happened the day before. Even if the previous day was filled with stress, mistakes, or emotional difficulty, the morning does not carry those experiences forward unless you consciously bring them with you through thought. This means each morning offers a chance to reset your internal environment before the momentum of old patterns takes over again. When this opportunity is consistently used, a new habit begins to form. Instead of waking up and reacting to life, you begin waking up and shaping your response to life. This reversal is significant because it shifts you from being influenced by circumstances to influencing how you interpret those circumstances. The consistency of this practice is what creates lasting change. One intentional morning may improve a single day, but repeated intentional mornings begin to rewire identity. The brain starts to associate mornings with conscious choice rather than automatic reaction. Over time, this repetition builds a new baseline personality that is more intentional, stable, and emotionally regulated. Eventually, the need for effort decreases because the system adapts. What once required deliberate focus becomes more natural. The body no longer immediately defaults to old emotional patterns upon waking, and the mind becomes more capable of maintaining clarity without constant struggle. In this way, the morning is not just the start of the day, it is the foundation upon which the entire day is constructed. How you begin determines the tone, direction, and emotional quality of everything that follows. And when that beginning is shaped by awareness rather than habit, the entire structure of the day begins to the brain, does not change through occasional insight or brief moments of inspiration. It changes through repetition combined with emotional intensity. This means that simply thinking about a positive outcome once or twice is not enough to rewire the mind or influence the body in a lasting way. What creates real change is the consistent mental rehearsal of a desired experience, paired with the feeling of that experience as if it is already real. When you mentally rehearse a situation, your brain activates many of the same neural circuits that would fire if the event were actually happening. The brain does not make a strict distinction between vividly imagined experiences and real external ones. This is why visualization can have such a powerful impact when it is done with focus and emotional engagement. Each time you imagine a future outcome clearly and repeatedly, you strengthen the neural pathways associated with that possibility. However, repetition alone is not enough if it is purely mechanical. The emotional component is what gives the mental rehearsal its biological impact. Emotion is the chemical language of the brain and body. When a thought is paired with strong emotion, the brain assigns greater importance to that experience. It marks it as significant, worth remembering, and worth preparing for. This is how learning and conditioning occur at a deep level. When you repeatedly visualize a desired outcome while feeling the emotions associated with it, such as gratitude, excitement, or fulfillment, you begin to condition your nervous system to accept that state as familiar. Over time, the body starts to respond as if that future has already been experienced. This is because the body does not distinguish between what is physically happening and what is being vividly imagined with emotional intensity. It simply responds to the chemical signals generated by the mind. As this process continues, something important begins to shift. The brain starts to organize itself around the repeated mental experience. It strengthens the connections that support the new vision and weakens those that are inconsistent with it. This is not an immediate transformation, but a gradual restructuring of neural networks. The more consistently the mind returns to the same vision, the more stable that new pattern becomes. At the same time, the body begins to adapt to this new emotional baseline. If you consistently feel elevated emotions during your mental rehearsal, your body starts to expect those states. It becomes less dependent on external circumstances to generate those feelings. Instead, it begins to produce them internally in response to thought alone. This is a key step in breaking old emotional conditioning that is tied to past experiences. Most people unconsciously rehearse their past more than they rehearse their future. They repeatedly think about previous failures, disappointments, or limitations, and in doing so, they reinforce the neural and emotional patterns associated with those experiences. This creates a loop where the past is continuously projected into the future, making change feel difficult or unlikely. Mental rehearsal breaks this loop by redirecting attention toward a different possibility. When the mind begins to consistently focus on a new outcome, the internal image becomes more familiar than the old memory. Familiarity is powerful because the brain prefers what it recognizes. As the new vision becomes more familiar through repetition, it starts to replace the emotional weight of the past. This does not erase memory, but it changes its influence over present behavior. The key is consistency. Occasional visualization may create temporary motivation, but consistent mental rehearsal builds identity. When you repeatedly see yourself acting, feeling, and living a certain way, the brain begins to adopt that version of you as the new reference point. Over time, your thoughts, decisions, and behaviors begin to align with that internal image without conscious effort. This process also influences perception. As the brain becomes conditioned to expect a certain outcome, it begins to notice opportunities and possibilities that align with that expectation. What once went unseen becomes visible because attention is now directed differently. In this way, mental rehearsal does not just change the internal state, it changes how you interpret the external world. Eventually, the repeated combination of thought and emotion creates a new baseline. What once required effort to imagine begins to feel natural. The nervous system becomes calibrated to a different emotional frequency, and the mind begins to operate from that state more consistently throughout the day. This is how internal change precedes external change. By repeatedly experiencing a desired future in the mind and body, you begin to reorganize your brain, regulate your emotions differently, and shift your behavior in alignment with that experience. Over time, what was once imagined becomes more likely to be lived. Happiness is often misunderstood, something that appears after external conditions improve, as if it is a reward waiting at the end of success, relationships, achievements, or circumstances aligning perfectly. This creates a constant state of chasing, where the mind believes that something outside of itself must change first, before a feeling of happiness can be allowed. In this pattern, happiness is always postponed into the future, dependent on events that may or may not happen, rather than being recognized as something that can be cultivated internally in the present moment. When happiness is treated as something external, the nervous system becomes conditioned to associate it with outcomes rather than states of being. This means that emotional stability becomes unstable because it relies on factors that are not fully under control. As a result, even when one goal is achieved, the mind quickly shifts to the next desire, creating a cycle where satisfaction is brief and immediately replaced by longing for something more. The emotional baseline remains unchanged because the internal state has not been addressed. However, happiness is not fundamentally a reaction to circumstances. It is a state generated by the brain and body based on patterns of thinking, feeling, and attention. This means it can be trained in the same way other mental and emotional states are trained. Just as stress can become a habit through repeated activation, calmness, gratitude, and contentment can also become habitual through consistent practice. The difference lies in where attention is directed and how experiences are interpreted internally. When attention is consistently focused on what is lacking, the brain produces emotional signals that reinforce that sense of lack. Over time, this creates a familiar emotional environment of dissatisfaction, even if external conditions are objectively good. On the other hand, when attention is directed toward what is already present, what is working, or what is possible, the brain begins to generate different chemical responses that support a more stable and elevated emotional state. This shift is not about ignoring reality, but about training perception. The practice of cultivating happiness internally begins with awareness of emotional patterns. Many people are not aware of how frequently their attention drifts toward worry, comparison, or anticipation of problems. These thought patterns happen automatically and often go unquestioned. But each time they are reinforced, they strengthen the emotional habit of dissatisfaction. Recognizing these patterns is the first step in changing them. Once awareness is established, attention can be intentionally redirected. Now, this is where happiness becomes a practice rather than a reaction. Instead of waiting for something to change externally, attention is shifted toward internal states such as appreciation for simple experiences, recognition of progress, or awareness of present moment stability. These shifts may seem small, but they begin to alter the chemical environment of the brain over time. The body also plays an important role in sustaining emotional states. When happiness is experienced repeatedly, the body begins to associate certain postures, breathing patterns, and physiological responses with that state. This means that happiness is not only psychological, but also physical. As the body becomes conditioned to these states, it becomes easier to access them without relying on external triggers. Consistency is what transforms happiness from a temporary feeling into a stable trait. Occasional moments of positivity are not enough to rewire the system. What matters is repeated engagement with thoughts and behaviors that support a more balanced internal state. Over time, the brain begins to default to these patterns more naturally, reducing the emotional volatility that comes from external dependency. As this internal shift deepens, perception of the external world also changes. Situations that once seemed stressful or limiting may begin to feel more manageable or less emotionally charged. This does not mean life becomes problem-free, but rather that the internal response to life becomes less reactive. But emotional stability allows for clearer thinking, better decision-making, and a more grounded experience of daily life. Eventually, happiness is no longer experienced as something rare or conditional. It becomes a baseline state that is accessible regardless of changing circumstances. This does not imply constant excitement or constant positivity, but rather a steady sense of internal balance that is not easily disrupted by external fluctuations. Emotions still arise, but they no longer dominate identity or control behavior in the same way. In this way, happiness shifts from being something pursued in the external world to something cultivated within. It becomes a skill developed through attention, repetition, and conscious awareness rather than a reward dependent on outcomes. And as this internal skill strengthens, the need to chase happiness externally gradually diminishes, replaced by a more stable and self-sustained emotional foundation. The end, happiness is not something that arrives when life becomes perfect. but something that is built from within through daily awareness, repetition, and conscious choice. When you stop chasing it outside and start cultivating inside, your entire experience of life begins to shift. You become less dependent on circumstances and more grounded in your own state of being. And in that stability, you don't just experience happiness occasionally, you begin to carry it with you.